get started since we have a lot to get through. If you're just now joining, please introduce yourself and share where you're calling from and maybe an example of something that you have done or you've seen others do to advocate for climate justice. Whoops. Okay, hi everyone. My name is Brittany and I am calling in from San Francisco, which sits on the traditional land of the Ramaytush people. I'm the founder of a nonprofit called My Life, My Stories, and our mission is to build intergenerational connections through the power of creativity and storytelling. I'm really excited to be a part of this whole series. So welcome back if you have come to one of our previous events, and welcome if you are new. But Brenda and I are really excited about this event in particular. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about the perceived disagreements among people of different generations when it comes to climate change. I think in media and in social media in particular, I often see young activists at the forefront of this fight for our planet's future. But I'm not so sure that's the whole story of who is actually advocating for climate justice. So I'm really looking forward to the conversations, I think, between the four of us, myself and Brenda, and our two amazing guests. We are representing four different generations and learning from everyone on how people of all ages are invested in how we can continue to safely live on this beautiful place that we call Earth. So thanks so much for being here. And I will turn it over to Brenda.
Hi, thank you. Welcome all. I'm Brenda, and I am calling in from Boston, which sits on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts and Pawtucket people. I am representing encore.org, an organization that brings together change makers, older and younger change makers, to solve problems, to bridge divides, and bring about a better future for all. I'm a member of the first cohort of the encore.org Public Voices Fellows, a partnership between the Op-Ed Project and that supports the up-and-coming thought leaders who are focused on intergenerational relationships, focused on aging, longevity, and social justice. Working with Brittany, this particular series really embodies the principles of what we think about when we think about collaboration and working together across race and age. To address difficult social issues, we take on the challenges and we welcome that you're here today to work with us. We wanted to take a moment, given yesterday's significance of yesterday, to just pause and reflect upon where we are and to do that in a moment of silence. So I'm going to ask everyone before we actually move into our discussion to just take a moment and pause and reflect and think about where we're at, and then we'll pick up and continue to move forward. So let's all take that moment to reflect. Okay, thank you all. I hope you had an opportunity to just think about the significance of not only yesterday, but of what we're going to be talking about today. And Brittany, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Brenda. So you may have noticed that Brenda and I made what is called a land acknowledgement when we introduced ourselves. And if you're new to this process, it's a formal statement presented at events like the one we're at today. And we do this to support a greater public consciousness of our history of colonization in this country. And we encourage you to do the same and learn more about honoring the native land you reside in And there's a website that you see on the screen, and I use this to find out where San Francisco is, where you can learn about the different territories that make up this country. So we'll also share this in the event post email if you're looking for to learn more. And if you're new to this event series, you might have heard about us through one of our incredible outreach partners. They're all listed on the screen here. Thank you so much to all of these amazing organizations and the communities that make up them. We're going to be including links to all of these communities and nonprofits if you want to learn more. But thanks so much for joining and spreading the word. And I do want to call out that the organization Can You Hear Us has an very helpful intergenerational climate conversations guide for free that you can download to support some of the conversations that we're having today. You can move that into some of your conversations with family or loved ones. Okay, so we'll move on to figuring out why we're all here today. And it's really to open a dialogue about racial justice that intentionally includes voices across the different generations, and including all different types of differences, including race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, and ability. And we want to recognize the power of story to understand and learn from different perspectives that we might not typically interact with in our day-to-day lives, and especially during the pandemic when we're more isolated than usual. And ultimately, we want to help you and us envision next steps about what we can do to advocate for climate justice. So we've got a jam-packed schedule for the next 75 minutes or so. So we're finishing up welcomes, and Brenda's going to introduce our amazing guest speakers, and we'll move into some poetry by Jade. And then after that, there's going to be a panel discussion led by Brenda. And then we'll have some small group discussions to discuss what was talked about in the panel. And we'll wrap up with some poetry by Nicole. And as always, with our last few events, we've kept the Zoom open for an additional 15 minutes if there are people who want to continue having the conversation around racial justice and climate justice. So I will turn it over to Brenda.
Okay, thank you so much. So we want to talk today about a crisis of climate and environment. We know about drought, we know about erosion, we know about the glaciers that are melting. We know it's combined also with toxic land, air, and water. We're all impacted by this, but some of us are impacted more than others. Those who really suffer from socioeconomic inequalities are actually more likely to die from the impact of what's happening with our climate and our environment. For example, African Americans are 75% more likely to live within communities that are in close proximity to industrial areas. These fenced-in communities are exposed to higher levels of toxic chemicals, leaks, and greenhouse gas emissions, for example. When you think about indigenous people who live along the coastline, whose diet really, and quite frankly, whose economy also are dependent upon the oceans, the rising levels of acidity are really threatening the livelihood of these people. In addition, people who live communities, who live inland, are threatened by mining, which is not only polluting the air, it's deleting the natural resources and creating toxins and depleting the water. So there are a lot of issues that we're facing. Urban dwellers are suffering from heat exposure and what they call heat exposure, and really trying very hard to mitigate this through various activities, but suffering in terms of health and well-being. We are now looking at an economic situation where when there is a natural disaster, communities of color fare far worse. White communities, for example, are far uh, more likely to really enjoy an increase, believe it or not, in health and wealth, excuse me, and reinvestment after a natural disaster than communities of color and minority communities that experience similar levels of damage. So the children, according to UNICEF, are the least responsible for climate change, but they are the greatest to be impacted by the burden. Unwilling to be passive victims, many people are beginning to stand up and rise up and fight for this planet. For those who are systemically blocked from access to resources, access to political clout, access to money, becoming agents of change is not without its challenges. And that's kind of the backdrop that we have today as we focus on our discussion. But I want to be able to introduce to you two extraordinary and inspiring activists who are really leaders on the forefront of um, the intersection of climate justice and race. So without further ado, I want to introduce both Jade Lozada and Nicole Horseherder. Now I'll start with Jade. She was born in New York City. She's an organizer, tutor, and writer, a policy director for Triage. Jade actually develops policy for progressive candidates, advocates for criminal justice, and really invest herself in developing the next generation of informed activists. Nicole is a member of, as executive director, excuse me, of Nicole, you're gonna have to correct this when you talk, when you introduce yourself, but To Nizone Ane, which I understand means beautiful water speaks. She's Dene living on the Black Mesa Highlands in Arizona. Nicole championed a community movement to protect underground freshwater resources. Coal mining activities in her area were depleting the water source while fueling two large electrical power plants. These plants, as you can imagine, were also polluting the environment in her native Navajo Nation homeland. Nicole's activism has really spearheaded a movement that not only shut down the coal mining, shut down the massive power plants, but also created opportunities for her community to grow and to flourish in ways that weren't imaginable before. So Nicole has an incredible story to share with us about what brought her to climate activism and what she's doing today. But before we get started, I'd like to first ask Jade if she would share with us her poem, The Worst Crime. Jade?
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And this poem I wrote recently within the last month. It's titled The Worst Crime. The worst crime I know men have committed is to turn nature into an oppressor. I tend land, concrete gorges in earth, pillared steel and brick, burdenless and guiltless below its sky. The first witness and last native to this island at the joint of the ocean's palm and the Hudson's stretch into us. An exodus from the diaspora for sins of skin darkening for lack of sun and barren pockets. Somewhere we search for home. So we bleed joy into summers enclosed in our beating heart labyrinthine barrios. The croon of a singer who never kissed his mother's land goodbye, laces and tangles treetops in the night, glides into the southern current of the sea, waters the pores of my concrete. Cascading lyrics from our windows return in lush platano leaves on the sill, when our words melt into English arroyos, pavement, that mutilation of Manhattan Island breaks open nature's bounty. Grotesque, undulating heat reverberates from asphalt, ricochets off brick into the heartbeat of car stereos. Diesel clouds halo above us. Toxins pumped from Earth's troves poison our breath. Of their sear on our skin, their imprint on our lungs, their toil in digging deep graves for early deaths. Here lies the fate of the first natives, to be mutilated as someone's ancestors mutilated Manhattan, raising forest, burying water with families, forcing brown bodies thereafter to swallow oceans in order to taste home. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Now, you're going to have an opportunity to connect again with Jade, and thank you for connecting us all through your poetry, Jade, because we'll be sharing another poem that Jade has written as part of our follow-up, which is Baby Girls. So I want everybody to be aware of and look forward to reading it, because it too is riveting and will continue to connect us in ways that we may not have imagined before. But speaking of connecting, I want to kind of turn my attention now to Nicole. And Nicole, your story is so connected to the land, and your family has lived on generations. Can you share the moment with me that you felt a calling to be prompted to protect the land? Nicole?
Sorry, I was muted. Yes, I think that as with many Native people who leave their homelands to go get an education, Western training, I did that, and I came home for the second time in 1993. And, you know, of course, my family was happy and proud, and I was eager to make myself useful in the for the community, and to my family. I had a discussion with my family, and their teaching is, you know, think about a home, think about a place to live, and I did that. But one of the things that I came across when I was going through this process with my family is I was missing the water source. What had happened to the springs that were near this area that I grew up in, and so more discussion with family members. You know, we realized that these springs had stopped producing water anywhere from 10 to 15 to 20 years ago. So those of you who may not know the geology of Black Mesa, where I live, is the high plateau in Northeast Arizona on the Navajo Nation. It rises about 6,300 feet in elevation on the southern end and about 7,000 feet in elevation on the northern end. On Black Mesa, I always describe to children that Black Mesa, all the rivers and streams are underground. They're not above the ground. Our plateau is a very complex hydrologic system beneath us, in which there are layers of aquifers and natural fissures in the ground bring the water to the surface. This is our source of water, and the disappearance of the only source of drinking water for us on a high plateau is very concerning, to say the least. And that's kind of where this journey, this activist journey, if you want to call it, began, because I think that it's hard for me to call it activism, and it's hard for me to identify so much in the category of, like, say, environmental justice. This is something that I feel like every human on earth is obligated to do, and that is to look after the elements of life, and water is one of them.
Can you just share with people what was happening to the water? What caused the?
Yeah, so you know, I began searching various areas, you know, and of course I had just come back from Western training, so much training, Western training, and knew how to do a little bit of research, ask the right questions, look at the local federal agencies near my home, and try to find out what happened to the water sources. And through talking to a number of different people and looking at agency reports, namely the USGS, I found out that one of the biggest users of groundwater in my area was the mining company. Peabody Energy was operating 2 mines at the time on Black Mesa and using water, the same groundwater that we those of us that live on Black Mesa relied upon. And not only were they using the groundwater, but they were using the groundwater in just enormous amounts. They were using excessive amounts of groundwater, pumping 4,400 acre feet to 6,000 acre feet a year on average. And at the time that I had come home, they had been doing this for about 30 years. And, you know, looking at USGS data showed that there was a correlation between Peabody's use of groundwater and the decline in the wells that the USGS was monitoring at the time. And so there we found the answer why the seeps and springs across the plateau were beginning to disappear.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I'm going to ask you in a little bit about what you did about it. I want to just turn my attention to Jade for a moment and just ask, what got you started? What was that pivotal moment that sealed your interest in climate change and climate justice?
Yeah, listening to Nicole's story, it definitely had a lot of meaning for her life and her community. And my entry into the climate movement was very different. It happened all by accident. I actually saw an Instagram ad one day for a spoken word poetry competition about the climate crisis. And because I was a writer and involved with community organizations surrounding writing, at the time, I entered the competition more for that than because I was driven by a really deep concern, or I should rather say like understanding of climate. And it was in the process of creating that story and doing the research about how my community is affected living in New York City that I understood we were at this intersection of racial exploitation and polluting plants, abuse to our waterways, and things of that nature that was creating New York City's climate story.
Okay. And what what about, have you have any exposure to like another area? I know you spent some time recently, was it in the Dominican Republic? What was your impression of climate change? Is there some type of climate justice issues that are going on in that area? I'm just curious if.
Yeah, there absolutely are. I just visited my grandparents for 6 weeks in the Dominican Republic. And I'm Dominican and Puerto Rican. I haven't had that same interaction with Puerto Rico, although that has a very more obvious connection to climate change. But when I was in the DR, I know that it's just an island that has a lot of variety in its geography and climate. And yet there are parts of it where there are supposed to be lakes and there's just nothing. Like it has all dried up.
Mhm.
And as varied as it is, a lot of the natural land is just out of balance. And certainly when you go there, it's a developing country. So we call it, there's a lot of like, I don't know, contention over that term, but because of it, a lot of the people there who are well off and are kind of like climbing up this social ladder are using things like cars and like a lot of fossil fuel that is ultimately bad for the planet. So it's just one of those dilemmas where to develop a country in our world, you have to harm the environment. And that's a catch 22 that I think the Dominican Republic and a lot of other places finds itself in.
Okay. I wonder, from your perspective, what's the relationship, do you think, between climate and environmental issues and racial justice? Do you see a correlation, or how do you see it, the relationship? Yes, I'm going to start with you, Jade, and then you're right, I'm going to pick up with Nicole again.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I've learned through the process of researching and writing my poem 2 years ago, but also through originally getting involved with strike organizing for September 20th, that climate change is only in existence because of these systems of exploitation against people who are poor or who are people of color. It is only with the possibility of abusing a workforce like that that you can create the type of output or productivity that landed us in this position. And so I think that though we like focus so much on the future and how climate policies can address communities in need and give jobs to them, or put these renewable energy projects to power their neighborhoods, there's also a story in its history about how a lot of these communities have always been exploited, and fossil fuel corporations or polluting corporations in general are just kind of the latest people to do so.
Okay. Okay. Nicole, I'm wondering, from your perspective, what's the relationship, if you see a relationship between climate change, climate justice, and racial justice?
Definitely, I think there's a relationship there. I think that, and for me, it's just watching the patterns throughout our history, since contact with first the Mexican government, and then of course, first the Spaniards who came, and then of course then the Mexican government, and then the Americans, because we live in the Southwest. That's been the order of contact for us. Throughout history, in the Southwest, it's been, of course, the taking of land, and then the discovery of resources. So then there's a lot of rezoning, redoing boundaries, all in an effort to find the easiest possible way to access the resources. And then, of course, to systematically take away certain parts of the livelihood of people to eventually get them to a place where they ultimately submit, or they ultimately end up in a situation where there's nothing left, no resources left. And in the case of the Diné people, part of that includes the taking away of livestock. I mean, part of the reason that we return to our lands and sign treaties with the federal government is an agreement to become sedentary peoples, follow a pastoral lifestyle only, send our children to school, and allow extraction to happen. And so in this process, people then eventually had their livestock taken away at a certain point so that we could make way for mining. And it always is surprising to me that federal agencies who are there to protect the people and to enforce certain regulation often become an agency of just rubber stamping for corporations, like in the case of Peabody Energy, in which the Office of Surface Mining, once having approved Peabody's permits to mine in on the Black Mesa Plateau, then kind of just turned a blind eye and stop regulating and stop monitoring the operation. And so today we're left with overdrawn aquifers and a lot of waste dumping and inadequately reclaimed portions, reclaimed lands, what little has been reclaimed, and so on and so forth. And you don't see this happening in affluent communities. You see this happening in communities of color, and indigenous people are probably one of the first testing grounds for these types of behaviors and policies to occur. So there's a pattern there, and it's hard to deny it.
Okay. Nicole, we had an opportunity to talk, so I know how important the elders were and helping to take on this challenge of protecting the water and the incredible, quite frankly, results that you as a community were able to achieve. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about the role that, because this is about intergenerational collaboration, the role that the elders played and helping to champion the cause of protecting the water and ultimately, like I said, the accomplishments that you achieved.
Yeah, certainly. The accomplishments of the organization Twanajona couldn't have happened without the close consultation and direction of the elders, the Diné elders, that I was so fortunate enough to have at the time that I came home from school and was ready to settle back into my community. A lot of those elders are not with us today. This is 20 years ago. I think I was lucky enough to have been able to consult with them and get direction, clear and specific direction from them in the many aspects of the work that we've done in the last 20 years. But just to relay a story, I was traveling to one of the many meetings that I was going to, a community meeting probably, and picked up an elder who wanted to go visit his relatives in the community next door. And we got to talking, and I let him know what we were doing. And we had many conversations before, but he then got real quiet and thoughtful, and then finally conveyed to me that, this thing that you're pursuing and these things that you're talking about water, and you're talking about the earth, and these things you can't just talk about without having some deeper traditional knowledge. And all these things, these elements, these are living entities, and they have songs and they have prayers that were bestowed upon these elements at the very beginning of time. And seek out those songs and seek out those prayers and make your offerings so that you can talk about these elements of life. You can talk about your relationship to these elements, have that relationship actually, and talk about these entities without repercussion, and that the blessings will always be there with you, that you have the authority to talk about these things. And this was really important to me, because after having gone to school the way that people had encouraged me to do, I came home thinking I was set for life. I had this wonderful Western training behind me, and I was gonna be a productive citizen of my community. And here it was that I didn't have that depth of training in my own traditional ways. And so immediately a new training program was introduced to me, and I had to, even though I grew up in the culture and spoke Dene as my first language, and grew up among monolingual speaking people in my family, I didn't have the kind of knowledge that usually only medicine people and elders carried in the community. And so here it was, this pathway was laid out for me, plain and clear, that I had to go down this pathway and learn these songs and prayers, so that I could speak more effectively about and lead more effectively in this work that we were taking on.
Okay, thank you. That is so incredible. And Jade, I know that your experience is a little bit different because you're in a youth-led organization, and your activities have been through primarily youth-led organizations. And I want you to talk a little bit about your experiences and why you think that model is so important.
Definitely. My first experience truly organizing was for the September 20th, 2019 climate strike in New York City. And I was part of the Youth Climate Strike Coalition, which worked really closely with a coalition of adult organizations. And I think that at that time, it was most of our first experiences entering this kind of organizing world or any real social justice movement. And so at first, it was really hard to balance learning while doing for such a big and near event. And so I think when it actually came down to execution, a lot of times the adults were doing most of the work, and then the young people who were involved were really relegated to like just a few people. And I noticed while I was there that a lot of times the people who were most involved with the organizing work of the strike on the young side with the adults were those who already had the connections because their parents were part of that movement, or they had been there for longer and there was less inclusivity. So I think that we didn't nail that first experience. But moving on from that, when I got into policy instead of activism, and now working with the New York Renews Coalition, which, in case anyone doesn't know, is about 200 environmental organizations in New York State that's kind of passing like the biggest legislation New York has. We have a youth committee in the coalition, and now we're working on, again, really amplifying our voices and creating a position with more influence and importance just within the coalition's work, because ultimately what's happening now and the like policies that they're creating are what we'll be living when we're in our 40s or 30s or 50s. So it's really unfair that we can be closed out of that.
I want to ask both you and Nicole, about tensions. Do you experience any tensions? Do you see any tensions as it relates to the generations and trying to address climate justice and climate change? I'm going to start with you, Jade.
Absolutely. I think that within New York Renews, for sure, sometimes it can be really hard. like navigating this place for us when we're trying to create it. And it is a person by person challenge and making the case for why youth should have a bigger role. I think that the youth organizations that I have been a part of were so important because we're figuring it out as we go. But that means that when we approach a lot of adults with our ideas, sometimes they're not always so receptive, or it's more of a like tokenization type of thing because we lack the intense training or degrees that they may have that make them more qualified to speak in that area. And I'm talking specifically about like New York City climate policy.
Okay. And Nicole,
Yeah.
did you feel or observe any tension or a shift in maybe shifting into tension as it related to the generations as you were pursuing the protection of the water and the resources and the land?
Yes, I think when I first began this work, I sought out the direction and the advice of elders frequently. A lot of them traveled with me, and we met regularly to organize and create the strategies moving forward. Today, my board is primarily elders, and throughout the lifetime of the organization, the board has the elders have always been the advisors and board members. I just want to say two things, I guess, about this issue here. I hope I don't forget the second one. One is that when we first began this work, we were going on the final decision making rested on people like myself and other founders of the organization. We were taking direct advice and direction from elders. We were constantly seeking their advice on things and constantly communicating what strategies we were going to use next. All this while, our kids were in tow. The kids were joined with us because sometimes it was fun and sometimes it wasn't, but mainly because this is what the moms and dads were doing, and kids kind of at the time, didn't really have a choice but to come. Some of it was fun. I mean, doing direct action sometimes could be fun. If you were doing like a horse ride to the nation's capital to try to send a message and that kind of thing, could be fun for younger people. Nevertheless, most of them didn't complain. So this is how things went at the time. Things are not like that so much today. Like I said, I'm missing today a lot of my elders, and today we are trying to instill in the younger generations how important this is, that they are inheriting these issues and these problems that were created by men who created industry, men who allowed industry. I mean, there are probably many women in there, but I'm just using men as a general term here. But this is what it is today. And the people that must take our place are the younger people. We only pray that they also seek the advice of wisdom which is usually in the older generations.
Mhm.
That's not to say that younger people cannot be wise, because many, many times there have been young voices that have really carried the wisdom of, older generations.
Mhm.
But in general, the young are still learning. They're still trying to find their way. It's the lack of experience that they don't have. And so, and this is the way it is. This is the way life is.
Mhm.
And so a lot of our younger kids hopefully have learned a lot from the way that we move this movement forward, and instilled into or incorporated into the organizing and into the movement some of the wisdom and some of the cultural ways, because protesting is not part of our culture so much. Direct action and in this sense is not so much part of our culture. But throughout the times we've had to do what we've had to do, we've had to go to war for our lands, we've had to fight the churches on behalf of our schools, when they took our children away, those kinds of things. And so it's really important to understand these things. And I think I had a really good grasp on that. And so no one was excluded, everyone was included. Everybody understood in the organizing that there was something at stake here,
Okay.
and that they were a responsible party in this movement.
Fantastic.
I
Well,
don't see that today so much.
okay. You know, as Brittany said earlier, we have so much we could talk about, and time just goes by so quickly. So believe it or not, I'm going to ask both of you what you're most proudest of in terms of your activism, and what you hope to achieve in the future. And then we're going to kind of bring it to a close. So I'll start with Jade. Jade, what are you most proudest of in terms of your activism? And what do you hope to achieve in the future?
Thank you for that question. I think that out of everything I'm most proud of what I've done this year, I'm on a gap year right now between high school and college. And I feel that triage has really broken through what was the initial barrier to have youth giving their additions to the climate policy space in a way that really was powerful. And the best example of this is we worked on a climate policy paper. Well, it was a series of papers to inform the platform of a local candidate named Tiffany Caban. And if you're from New York City, you might be familiar with her. She's something of this like local superstar and kind of comparable to like an AOC of local politics, and she's from Queens, and wanted to have something very progressive for her climate platform. And we were able to give her recommendations about how city council should go about boosting like climate education in public schools, and even implementing a form of climate reparations for the communities that are nearby polluting sites. And that was actually included in her platform, and she's pretty likely to win. It's very exciting.
Yes.
Looking forward, I think that I just want to do more of that. I really want to see the young people I'm working with, especially those from environmental justice communities, not only be heard, but have a seat at these decision making tables, and for them to be trained and then included in the decisions that are being made for our future. And that would look like all of our policymakers and decision makers actually reaching out to their high schools and to their communities, inviting people to town halls, and then keeping them updated about what they're doing and how they're implementing their ideas.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Nicole, I know we don't have much time, but I really would love to hear what you're most proud of and what you hope to achieve in the future.
Yeah, so I think I'm proud of a lot of things, and I'm proud of the work with my community, and I'm proud of the relationship with my community. But I think what I'm most proud of is the fact that I have been able to do this work for the amount of time and still be still find some success in it and continue to build relationships, and become a place where the youth, the younger generation can go to actually learn something, where history is of resource extraction and the history of our peoples and the movements is now housed in under one organization and is there for the youth, the younger generations, and anyone to come to this spot and really learn something that you can't find in the current the education system that's available today.
Okay. You know, our audience always loves to know what they can do. They always want to be able to take actions, and many people are struggling to take actions. They're struggling to recycle, they're struggling to buy hybrid cars or reduce their carbon footprint in so many ways. So I'm going to ask if you have any suggestions of help to others of how they can get started in being good stewards of the land or being activists and advocates for climate and climate justice. Jay?
I know that this can be a very hard question to answer, and it certainly was for me, because ultimately there are just a few companies that kind of decide how much plastic is produced every year and things like that. So the individual actions don't make the huge impact that we want it to. And I've realized that the best solution to this on an individual level is probably just to research the organizations in your community or in your state that align with your interests and what you really care about related to climate change. And then when they ask you to email a representative or do something, you actually do it. I know that sometimes we think emailing representatives and phone banking, things like that, aren't very effective, but it can actually mean a lot when a representative gets like 60 calls that day about one single piece of legislation. And yeah, those organizations would definitely appreciate your support.
Okay, thank you. And Nicole, what do you think?
Yeah, yeah, I just want to echo what Jade has said. I think that's very, very important. And then I would also like to just challenge every single person to do their part in reducing the amount of waste. Um, carry your own cups and refill those water bottles and reduce the carbon footprint as much as you can, because that is the most that any individual person can do.
Thank you both so much. You were incredible. Brittany, I apologize. I know I went a little bit over. I don't know if there were any questions that you wanted to add, but I'm going to hand it over to you.
No, that was fantastic. Thank you so much, Brenda, and especially to Nicole and Jay. There are so many good ideas that were being generated in the chat, and I'm sure that will continue in the small group discussion, but I think we can move on. And so we will break out into small intergenerational or hopefully intergenerational groups. And these are the two questions that we want you to think about. And I put them in the chat. Is there anything that resonated from what Jade and Nicole shared just now? And did this conversation spark any new ideas on how we can, in particular, work across generations for climate justice? I know there are so many individual actions we can take, and Jade and Nicole have both listed so many, and people in the chat have also done that. But maybe we can use this as a brainstorming session to think outside the box. I know Elaine had a bunch of good ideas. So we'll do this for 15 minutes. And what's going to happen is that you'll be put into a random group, and we don't have a facilitator for these groups. So we're going to ask the person with the name that starts at the very beginning of the alphabet to keep time. And essentially what this is just making sure everyone has a chance to speak. It's these groups go by so quickly. So as long as someone has a chance to introduce themselves and just share what they think for about 2 minutes and make sure everyone goes around the circle, that would be super helpful. So that's the person with the name that starts at the beginning of the alphabet. The person in your group with a name that is at the very end of the alphabet will start the discussion. So you'll take the lead in introducing yourself and share your thoughts. And then what typically works is just randomly calling on someone else to popcorn the chat and keep the discussion going. And at any time, if you feel uncomfortable in your group, simply leave the breakout room and we can hang out in the main room or reassign you, do whatever makes you feel most comfortable. But we're really looking forward to hearing what comes out of these discussions. Just a few reminders before we break is that we encourage you to listen deeply and be willing to be changed by what you hear. And when you share your thoughts, consider using phrases such as "I think" or "I feel," which allows us to speak from our own experience and avoids generalizations and speaking on behalf of people who may not be represented in your conversation. Be open to feeling both supported and challenged. And lastly, we do not tolerate any racism or stereotyping, especially across generations or ages. So we reserve the right to remove participants. Whoops, so I think that was it. Duncan, I think you will be deploying the groups. Anything else to add?
Nope. I will send a 5-minute warning, but you also see a timer on your screen, and I'm gonna open up the rooms.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We're going to do something called a chat waterfall. So I hope you enjoyed your conversations with your small groups. If you want to share a commitment that you've previously made before joining this event or something that you haven't thought of before and put that in the chat, that would be really cool to see what you guys are thinking of in terms of advocating for climate justice. Okay, so as a closing, we want to remind everyone of our last event, which is going to be on Wednesday, June 16th. And it's going to be a Juneteenth celebration. And we will be sending an email with information to all the resources that we shared today and a survey, which I also just put in the chat if you want to give us some feedback. Otherwise, we will close today's event with a poem from Nicole called A Prayer to Mother Earth. So I'll turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you again. Can everybody hear me? I'm not on mute. Am I?
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
great. So this is called A Prayer to Mother Earth. Shemana Hassan, Mother Earth, Shitrat Yadishih, Father Universe. Between you, I exist. I am your child. I exist here with all creation, not above, not beneath, but the same. From the smallest voice to the loudest voice, among the plant life, the wildlife, those that crawl the earth, the four-legged, the winged. Mother Earth, Father Sky, between you, I exist. As a child between its mother and its father, I exist. Long before my mother on earth is gone, long after my father on earth is gone, between you, I will exist. I find comfort in your valleys and clarity on your mountains, persistence in your heat, resilience in your cold, hope in the clouds, faith in the thunder. I am meek. Cleanse in your water, heal my body, your blood, medicine water, sacred water, giver of life, taker of life, holy water. Mother Earth, Father Sky, between you, I exist.
Thank you, Nicole. Brittany?
Thanks. Yeah, go ahead.
As I say, are we going to do the optional 15 minutes?
Yeah, let's do it. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Nicole, for closing with that beautiful poetry. We will see you all in about a month and a half if you want to join us. Otherwise, we're going to stay on for another 15 minutes or so if anyone wants to continue the conversation.